Welcome to the first video of the semester. We're going to give you an introduction to cryptography. In particular, we're going to look at some important concepts and terminology. So the first thing we're going to do is explain what the general process is when we do cryptography. We're going to explain how ciphers are used to both encrypt messages and then decrypt them on the other end. Then we're going to define some important terms that we will be using about cryptography throughout the course. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is the concept of privacy. And one way of describing privacy is the act of being able to control information about yourself. Cryptography is the act of creating a message that can be read only by the person sending the message and the person receiving it. And so you can think of cryptography as being related to privacy by enabling people to communicate in a private way. So here's the process that we use to do cryptography. First thing is we have something called plain text. And all plain text is that's the message that you want to send to the person you're sending the message to. Encryption is the next part of the process, and that's where we take our plain text, use some kind of method of cryptography to convert that into something called ciphertext. And what ciphertext is, that's just the encrypted message that hopefully cannot be read by anybody but you and the person that you're sending it to. Once that person gets your message, they have to use the act of decryption to turn the ciphertext back into plain text so that they can read the message. So the process is going to look like this. You start with plain text over there on the left. You apply the process of encryption to get to ciphertext. And then you apply the process of decryption on the ciphertext to get back to the plain text. So every time you do a combination of encryption and then decryption, you end up with the exact same thing. And that gives us what we call either an inverse process, is maybe what you might want to call it, or in mathematics we'd call them inverse functions. So here's what we would do for a specific message if we wanted to actually send something to another person. First thing we would have to do is agree on a cipher. And what a cipher is that's just a general method for encrypting and decrypting messages. So we've used a cipher before on the problems that we were working on Wednesday, and that is on those cryptograms, right? So on the cryptograms, each letter of plain text corresponds to another letter of ciphertext. So that's the method that we're using. We are pairing a letter of plain text with another letter of ciphertext. And you should know that there are many ways that you can implement this cipher. One for every different way that you can pair plain text with ciphertext. So even though it is a very clear way of encrypting messages, there are many ways that you can apply this particular cipher. Now, once you agree on a cipher, you got to get a little more specific. You must secretly agree on something called a key. And what a key is it's something that is used to either encrypt the plain text into ciphertext or decrypt the ciphertext into plain text, or both. It could be a number, it could be a word, it could be a physical object even. But it's got to be something that enables you to go between ciphertext and plain text. So for instance, if you are agreeing on the cipher of a cryptogram, you've also got to agree upon a key. So that's, for a cryptogram, that's just going to be a table that tells you which letters of plain text correspond to which letters of ciphertext. So it's going to look something like this, right? So that the upper row of each of those little tables is going to be the plain text, and the bottom row is going to be a ciphertext. So for instance, if I wanted to encrypt the message, "Hey Jude," what I would do is, for instance, for the first word, I would look for the letter H on the plain text, since "Hey Jude" is a plain text, and then I'd look right below it to see what the ciphertext is. So for H, I'd look over, I'd see right below that is W, so I have W for my first letter. For the E, you can see the E on the top row has P right below it, so P would be the ciphertext for E. And then Y, if you look over way down on the bottom right, Y is the plain text, means that R is going to be the ciphertext, so you get WPR for hey. And then if you do the same thing for Jude, you get GLCP, and there's your ciphertext. Now, if somebody sent you some ciphertext, WUVXBJLY, you would do the opposite process. So those are ciphertext. So you look on the bottom row of each of those tables. So if you look for the W, that's a little bit harder to find because they're not in alphabetical order. But once you found the W, right above it is an H. If you look for the U, right above that is an I. So you end up with high. And if you do the same thing with V, X, B, J, L, and Y, you'd end up with walrus. So you sent hey Jude, and Jude sent back hi walrus. All right, so let's now talk about keys more generally. Right? Keys, as it turns out, is a really nice metaphor for what we actually use them for in cryptography. So for instance, if you think of encryption as locking the message, right? And then you think of decryption as unlocking the message, then what the keys do is they're used to lock and unlock messages, just like real physical keys are used to lock and unlock locks, doors, safes, things like that. So there are actually two different kinds of keys that we use in cryptography, and they actually correspond to the kinds of keys we use in treating actual keys and actual locks. So the first kind is the kind that we're probably most familiar with, or at least maybe it's the first kind of key that comes to mind when we think of keys, and those are symmetric keys. And what symmetric keys means is that, well, think about if you have a deadbolt on your door. You don't need a different key for locking and unlocking your door. You can use the same key to both do the locking and the unlocking. So when we talk about that in terms of cryptography, those are what are called symmetric keys. We use symmetric keys. Those are used for both encrypting the message and for decrypting the ciphertext. So for instance, that table that we had for the cryptograms, those were asymmetric key because we used the same tables to create the ciphertext as we did to figure out what the plain text was. However, what we're going to discover is that there are certain keys in cryptography called asymmetric keys. And those work more like a padlock. Now imagine that somebody gives you a padlock that is unlocked. You can take that padlock without much knowledge and you could just put it on somewhere and actually lock it yourself. Right? However, once you lock it, you can't unlock it unless you have some additional key, or if it's a combination, lock the combination. You can only unlock it if you have that key or combination. If we think what that means in terms of cryptography, what that means is if we have an asymmetric key, that means we can have one key for encrypting a message, and then that should be easy for everyone, and then another key for decrypting that should only be able to be done by the person who receives it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to the end of this video is addresses the question, what if you want to decrypt somebody else's ciphertext when it's not intended for you? So that gives us something called cryptanalysis, and all cryptanalysis is the act of decrypting messages when you don't have the key. So if you think about what we were doing with the cryptograms, nobody gave us the table of values. Nobody gave us the key for encrypting those cryptograms. We use frequency analysis, knowledge of language, in order to figure out what the messages were without knowing what the key is. And that's going to be another important part of cryptography. All right, so now you're ready to work on the activities. They're called Introduction to Cryptography, and they're on the PDF file that is included with this video.